Social 20-1, 20-2, interwar foreign policy. So what we're going to look at now, what were the nation states, what were the predominant nation states up to between World War One and World War Two? And before we get into it, I'd like you to think back to our examination of just the plain old nation state. Again, a nation state is a sovereign nation, and people recognize, other countries recognize its sovereignty. And what it wants, when you get right down to it, is just survival and security. So, how can a nation state ensure its survival and security? If you'll recall, they can choose to expand, they can choose to defend, they can forge alliances. Um, some may not want to be part of an alliance, but they've really got no choice if they want to ensure their security. Some may choose to isolate and set themselves apart from the others. And finally, you may interact and forge negotiations. So those are the options open to a nation state. Let's see what some of them are up to between the wars. Policy number one we'll look at is expansionism. So what countries were expanding and at whose expense were they expanding? Um, Expansionism might seem like an obvious choice if you're looking for survival as a nation state. The bigger your nation state, perhaps the more powerful you'll be, perhaps more resources, the better you can defend yourself, the bigger you are. Well, maybe. We'll see how that worked out for the countries that tried. This policy would be based on extreme nationalism. In fact, let's just be honest, expansionism is an example of ultranationalism, and you're going to base it on social Darwinism and what we call ethnocentrism. I think you know by now what ethnocentrism is. You think that your culture is superior to another. It might be the way you rationalize or give yourself permission to expand at someone else's expense. Social Darwinism is it's a scientific movement from the late 1800s by which you classify races on a hierarchy and according to what you think is science. And of course, the idea is ludicrous, but what you think is science would tell you that maybe your race is superior to other races. And it's your duty, it's your call of nature to conquer and dominate these other races. Those would be your motives for expansionism, among other things. So the first country we'll look at will be Japan. And you might have learned this back in 10-1, but pre 1800, Japan was actually an isolationist country, a monarchy. They were relying on feudalism, they were very agrarian. Japan was slow to modernize, they were slow to industrialize. In fact, Japan awakens to the cold, sobering reality in the early 1900s. A lot of the world has left them behind. A lot of other countries modernized, embraced technology, went through their industrial revolutions, and Japan still hadn't. And so Japan awakens at the dawn of the 20th century, recognizing they're behind, and they've got to do some fast catching up, or it's going to be too late. There had been a population explosion in Japan, and they needed resources, in particular coal, oil, and precious metals, which Japan didn't have. So they're going to have to take them from somebody else. So that drove Japanese expansionism into the Pacific. I should say the Pacific. And as they went, they it's hard to explain. A lot of Southeast Asia had already been colonized by European powers. So just as European powers scrambled and occupied Africa, scrambled for and occupied Africa, European powers also were involved in the scramble for Southeast Asia. Uh, so most of Southeast Asia had already been colonized by a European power. So for Japan to expand in the Pacific, they're going to have to liberate, take away those European colonies and keep them for themselves. They called that liberation of these European colonies the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which basically meant Japan is going to take Southeast Asian colonies away from Europe and they're going to keep them for themselves. But they rationalize the action by saying, we're doing this for Asia. We're getting rid of a European oppressor and we're going to have an Asian oppressor in charge now. So the Southeast Asian colonies really didn't gain anything by Japan liberating them from the European uh, mother countries. But I guess you could say they did now belong to an Asian country. Instead of being European colonies, they're now Asian colonies. I'm not sure it made much difference for the colonies that this happens to. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Really good example of expansionism and ultranationalism. There's a map demonstrating the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So here's Japan, really just a big island that needs resources. So they will expand to the Asian mainland. They're going to go into Korea and occupy parts of China. They're going to occupy and take away French Indochina, Burma, Siam, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, the Philippines, and so on. So each of these regions in red originally would have had a European colonizer. What Japan is doing is they're driving out that European colonizer and they're taking those territories for themselves. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Ironic term, Japan is going to prosper from this, but not the colonies they're taking away from Europe. Those colonies are going to suffer greatly at the hands of Japan. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria and occupied. And you're probably wondering what's the League of Nations up to? I mean, I thought they were supposed to stop this from happening. League of Nations fails miserably in dealing with Japan. They really don't do anything. They exert some diplomatic pressure, but not much. Don't forget, too, we can't be too hard on the League of Nations. I mean, after all, this is the 1930s. It is the Great Depression, which you'll learn about more in grade 12. But I mean, countries are fighting unemployment rates of 25% and even more, which was catastrophic to their economies. So it's hard to be too critical on the League of Nations. It was the Great Depression. And by the 1930s, there's just a general lack of will to do anything. No one wanted to go through the horror of World War I again. They're trying to get over it. So there just wasn't enough will, there wasn't enough drive to want to go over and stop Japan from doing what they were doing. To be honest, I'm not sure the League even could have done that in the midst of the Great Depression. I'm not sure they had the resources to actually make it happen. Don't forget, wars cost money, and money was in short supply during the 30s and the Great Depression. In the end, Japan walked out of the League of Nations altogether. Don't forget that Japan itself was one of the great powers in the Great Power Council of the League of Nations. I mean, you would think they would be setting an example and not expanding at someone else's expense. But again, it shows you why the League of Nations failed. Um, the great powers couldn't put aside their own national interest in favor of international interest. And so here's an example, a demonstration of why the League just didn't work at that time. They would later invade and occupy even more of China in 1937, and they would eventually to expand into the Pacific, which over time would lead them into direct conflict with the America, and that was Japan's undoing. As you know, they would lose the war to America in World War II, and they lost that war catastrophically. And we'll talk more about that later on in the chapter. So Japan will, occupy all of these regions here, as we looked at already. And then they begin their drive across the Pacific, taking other islands as they go. And eventually that drive across the Pacific would lead them into Pearl Harbor in direct conflict with the Americans, and that would be the unraveling of the Japanese Empire. Another map showing you Japan expansionism. I don't know why I have it there, the other one's better. All right, Italy. Let's see what Italy's up to. Again, Italy is one of the great powers in the former League of Nations. And so let's see what they were doing between the wars. Much like Japan, Italy was late to industrialize. We can't really blame them. Italy didn't actually even unify until 1871, so they come to the table late. They've missed out on the scramble for Africa. There's nothing left in Africa, really. They're led by a fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini. Understand fascism as a very extreme ideology way of looking at the world. Fascism usually brings with it profound extreme ethnocentrism and racism. Uh, it's very elitist in nature. It would fit very well with expansionist policies. You'll learn more about fascism in grade 12 next year. But Benito Mussolini brought back the fascism of the old Roman Empire, and in fact even called his concept Neo-Rome, bringing back that old dominant Roman Empire. Mussolini's looking for a couple of things. He needs resources to industrialize, but he's also looking for prestige. He's trying to expand his empire to get more international recognition and prestige. He labels it Mare Nostrum. In other words, I'm going to bring back the old Roman Empire. Anything that used to border the Mediterranean Sea and used to be part of the old Roman Empire, I'm going to take that back. And I'm going to rebuild Italian prosperity and international recognition. He also called it irredentism, which was a policy by which he was going to return uh, Italian speaking peoples to the Italian Empire. I'll show you on a map in a few seconds. So in 1935, he invades Abyssinia, which is what we call present-day Ethiopia. If you'll recall back to 10-1, two African territories were never colonized during the scramble for Africa. They were Liberia and Abyssinia, Ethiopia. So in 35, Mussolini invades Abyssinia, and he's coming in with modernized weapons. He's got tanks, machine guns, and so on, and he's able to overwhelm the Abyssinian military and occupy and take over Abyssinia. Again, we're waiting for the League of Nations to act, but it failed to act. Britain didn't want to get involved because they didn't want to jeopardize their control over the Suez Canal. The League did embargo oil. They didn't sell oil to Italy, which Italy really needed, but America wouldn't cooperate. They continued to sell oil to the League, so the embargo really didn't work. Again, the world is in the throes of the Great Depression. They have other economic problems, and let's be honest, uh, Western Europe and the whole Western Hemisphere is very ethnocentric itself. They weren't willing to do much to help an African country. So again, the League failed to act. They sat that one out. So Britain had selfish reasons for not getting involved. Italy, Japan, America never joined in the first place. So this system just didn't work because nations couldn't put aside their own national interests. By the way, we'll get to them later, but Hitler by this point is in charge of Germany, Nazi Germany, and he's watching this happen. He's watching the League fail to act as other nation states invade and expand at the expense of nation states. So he's taken all this in, and he's going to undergo his own expansionist policy. All right, so there's Abyssinia, what we would call Ethiopia today. Here would be Mare Nostrum. So this would be the policy of Mare Nostrum. Anything bordering the Mediterranean in the light green color, Mussolini wanted to get back for Italy. He's never going to do it, but that was his dream for the Italian Empire. Let's move on to Germany. German expansionism actually has its own saying as well, its own name, Lebensraum, which translates to German living space. You learn more about him later in 30-1, his actual rise to power and his specific policies. But again, Adolf Hitler watched Mussolini very closely, modeled himself after Mussolini, and did a better job of it. So another fascist dictator, very ethnocentric, who wanted to restore German pride after the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. So if you'll recall, Treaty of Versailles was very punitive on Germany. They had to sign the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. So even though you can't solely blame Germany for World War I, most of the powers did at the time, and they took advantage of them at the Treaty of Versailles. Germany, of course, was demilitarized. They had to pay massive war reparations. They lost Alsace-Lorraine. They lost their overseas colonies. So Germany was angry and enraged over the Treaty of Versailles. All Hitler really did was he took advantage of that rage, that anger, and he gave it focus. And he used it as a vehicle to rise to power in Germany. In 1933, he passes the Enabling Act and becomes the official dictator who is now unaccountable to the German public. Germany is no longer a democracy. In 1934, Germany walked out of the League of Nations. They had joined later on. In 1935, they began to remilitarize. They're not supposed to be doing this. This is a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In October of 36, he reoccupies the Rhineland again. Was not supposed to be doing this according to the Treaty of Versailles. He backed the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. There was a civil war in Spain between um, left-wing communists and right-wing fascists. The Nazis backed up the right-wing fascists to the point of testing what are known as incendiary weapons, so napalm. If you don't know, napalm is a flammable gel that you drop in the form of a bomb, and everything that it sticks to, it burns at a very high degree, and it's a horrible way to go. It's the kind of weapon you would unleash on a civilian population. The Germans test out their napalm at the fishing village of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War to see how it's going to work, but also to ensure that the fascists win the Spanish Civil War, and eventually they do. In November of 36, um, the, the Germans sign the Anti-Comintern Pact, which is an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the Germans are using multiple, and so are the Japanese and Italians, using multiple strategies for their nation states to ensure their security. So each nation state, Germany, Japan, and Italy, is using expansionism. Each of them is also using an alliance structure. So the Axis powers in World War II will be Germany, Italy, and Japan. Um, they forge an alliance. It's called the Anti-Comintern Pact, or the Axis power. In March of 38, the Germans unify again with Austria under what is known as Anschluss. One more time, they're not supposed to be doing this. This is a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. And in September of 38, um, they signed the Munich Pact, which basically is an agreement that Germany is going to take the Sudetenland. If you'll recall, to make the nation state of Czechoslovakia a Treaty of Versailles, they took land, some land from Germany to create the nation state of Czechoslovakia. So Germany takes back that territory known as the Sudetenland. And the Munich Pact was basically an agreement that Hitler promised to not take any more than just the Sudetenland. And if he promised that that's all he was going to take, Britain and France were going to leave him alone. We call that policy appeasement. Appeasement is basically, in a simple way of saying it, giving into a bully, hoping that they don't come back for more later. But as we all know, you give into that bully one time, they're probably coming back the next day for your lunch money and the day after that until you stand up to them. That might be one way of looking at the Munich Pact and the policy of appeasement. In Germany's defense, they would say, hey, listen, the Sudetenland is populated by Germanic peoples, which it was. So from their perspective, they would just be taking back what should really have been theirs in the first place, if we decide the Treaty of Versailles was too punitive on Germany, which in some ways it probably was. Sudetenland, by the way, was very wealthy, had a lot of commerce and industry. That's maybe why they wanted it more. However, you know, Hitler came back in 39 and took the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Famous painting by Pablo Picasso demonstrating the Guernica massacre in 1937. Again, Guernica was a civilian fishing village. None of those people had anything to do with the Spanish Civil War or any war. They wanted to try out the incendiary weapon, the napalm, hence Picasso's famous painting. So the bright light would be the napalm coming from the sky, and you can see the chaos that ensues shortly after the napalming of Guernica. That won't be the only example of, of the targeting of a civilian population with napalm or any bomb for that matter. What you learn, World War II involved targeting deliberately civilian populations. The thinking was that if we kill enough of their civilians, they'll force their government to surrender and we'll win the war that way. Both sides were doing it. There's a map of Germany in 1919. So, to create Czechoslovakia, they took some territory from Germany, the Sudetenland, and they gave it to Czechoslovakia. So, this territory, the Sudetenland, would have been populated by Germanic peoples. And Hitler would have said, "Is all I'm doing is I'm returning those people back to Germany, their true homeland." Here's a more detailed map of what's going on in terms of Lebensraum, German expansionism. So step one, of course, was remilitarizing the Rhineland. He wasn't supposed to do this. There's the unification with Austria, Anschluss with Austria in 1938. Again, he's not supposed to be doing that. There is the annexation of the Sudetenland under the Munich Pact. And then he comes later and takes all of Czechoslovakia. So a really good visual of Lebensraum, of German expansionism. Reaction, well, we already talked about it. You know, by and large, German aggression early on was met with appeasement. And again, tough to be too hard on the British and the French for appeasing. They didn't want a repeat of World War One. No one really did. We've already talked about the horror and the cost of that. So no one was in a big rush to go into another war. So by and large, they let it go. Again, we're in the throes of the Great Depression. Economies are stagnant and even in retraction. A lot of governments would have said we've got bigger problems. Germany does have a head start on remilitarization, however, and even if you did decide to turn and fight them right then and there, they probably had the advantage. Again, nations are putting their own national self interest first. Um, Another uh, historical event you need to pay attention to is the Nazi Soviet non aggression pact. This was a weird one in that communists and fascists, the Germans, of course, are fascists, the Soviets are communist. Ideologically, they are opposite from each other. They should hate each other theoretically, which they did. However, ironically enough, they sign a treaty, a pact between the two of them, which basically said we're not going to fight each other. What both sides were really doing was buying time because they knew they'd be fighting each other sooner or later. Part of the non-aggression pact involved the division of Poland. So Soviet Union's going to get half of Poland and Germany will get half of Poland. In September of 39, Germany actually invaded Poland and that triggered World War I. 2 days later, the British and the French would declare war on Germany, and now you've got the beginning of World War II. The French had retreated into the policy of defense. So, in terms of choices a nation state can make, the French are forced to choose choice number two, which is defense, and they're also going to forge their little alliance as well to gain security for their nation state. Something you need to realize, everyone knew, especially in France, that one day the Germans were going to be coming back. Everyone knew that Germany was mad over the Treaty of Versailles and they were going to be coming back one day. So to provide security, the French built what is known as the Maginot Line, which was a fortification along the German and French border. I'll show you a picture in a few seconds. And the Little Entente. The Little Entente was an alliance between Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, Poland, and of course France. It's called the Little Entente and not the Big or the Medium Entente because they were made up of minor countries in Europe at that time. They couldn't get the British involved or any of the big players. So the Little Entente. And the French also used the policy of appeasement to try and gain security for their nation state during this time. There is a side view of the Maginot Line, actually a miracle, a military miracle for its time in the 1920s. So when it was built in the 1920s, this was very state of the art. This was very modern. This is a side view of the Maginot Line. And you have to imagine this running along the border between Germany and France, billions of dollars to construct it. So it was very complex. Artillery outposts, a diesel fuel power plant. Of course, a lot of it's underground, so you would need a fresh air supply, telephone switchboards, recreation hospitals, theaters, stores, etc. Ammunition, a movie theater for entertainment, airlocks, underground garages, and even airplane hangars along the Maginot Line. Not to mention the barbed wire and tank traps. Um, Germany was expected to come this way. So in the 20s, this was state of the art and probably would have done the job. It's antiquated by the 1930s. There's the Maginot Line. It had two weaknesses. Um, I don't know if I've got a picture here. I guess I don't. The Maginot Line had two glaring weaknesses. Number one, it didn't run all the way in terms of a strong fortification through Belgium, because the thinking was this would violate Belgian sovereignty and neutrality. So the Maginot Line didn't go all the way to the North Sea. So what it meant was Germany could flank it, just like the Schlieffen Plan. Germany could flank the Maginot Line. And the other weakness was at the Ardennes Force. So at one point, um, in a region known as the Ardennes Force, the thinking was this forest was just so thick, there's no way German tanks could get through it, so they didn't build the Maginot Line at the Ardennes Force. And then, ironically enough, when Germany invades, they do the sweeping maneuver through Belgium again, and they drive right through the Maginot Line. State of the art in the 20s, but did have a couple of weaknesses. The Americans, as I've already talked about, withdrew into what was called isolationism. So they stayed out of European affairs. Politically, they didn't get involved. They didn't even join the League of Nations after all. And economically, they retreated into isolationism as well. They invoked tariffs on imports coming from Europe to America, and they chose to isolate themselves. That's going to hurt them. They just don't know it yet. Britain embraced the policy of appeasement until they recognize that they do have to fight and defend themselves, and that's why they declare war when Germany invades Poland in 1939. Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union in 1923, they had fought, they had just come out of a civil war. This was, of course, a communist revolution, so Russia takes some time to expand, but eventually they do, and they themselves invade Finland in 1939. Again, a violation of the League of Nations. So if we go back to that League of Nations, Britain didn't do enough and France didn't do enough. Italy, Japan became aggressive and violated the League of Nations that way. Russia joined in 34 and they themselves invaded Finland in later on. Uh, the US never joined and retreated into isolationism. So it just kind of highlights why it didn't work. They always put national interest first, and that's what broke down the League of Nations. And that is the foreign policy of the major players between the wars. We'll come back and see what happened during World War II later.